everyone. I'm Amrita Batnal. I'm a senior editor here at Devex, and today I'm joined by my colleague, senior reporter Michael Igo. And together, we're really excited to talk to Ambassador Dr. John Nkengasong. John, I'm just going to take a moment to sort of acknowledge this moment that we're in right now. The way I see it, there's three things at play. COVID-19 has highlighted deep inequities, and some of which you yourself were fighting on the front lines as the head of Africa CDC. You're here now in your new role with PEPFAR's 20-year anniversary coming up, and you're the first Africa-born leader of the US Global AIDS Program. Do you see that as a pivotal moment?
It is, indeed. And let me perhaps start where you initiated a conversation about the inequalities and inequities that COVID exposed. Just this morning, I was reflecting on when I left the Africa CDC just 5 weeks ago, what COVID taught me. It was, one, the connectivity, that a disease can emerge anywhere in the world, and within 2 months, it is a threat everywhere in the world. That is connectivity. Vulnerability, that at any rate, regardless of where you are in the world, that disease threat makes you very vulnerable. If you look at the Global Health Security Index, it's very nice mapping of where countries are, and countries that were greenish in color, which means they were supposed to have strong systems, were as impacted as countries that had red dots all over, showing that they didn't have systems. And lastly, the inequalities, not just between the North and the South, but even within developed countries. I mean, you saw that. So the commonalities between pandemics, whether you're dealing with COVID-19 pandemic or the HIV pandemic, is that you fight them with the same principles, which is you have to understand your virus, what I call the pathogen, the first P. You have to understand the people, that is the population you're dealing with. You have to understand the policies, right policies. You have to understand the politics, and you have to understand the partnerships. So if you bring those 5 Ps to play into the new world that I'm playing it, which is, I call it the old new world, because before I left the US CDC to go to the African Union to set up Africa CDC, I've spent more than 25 years since 1988 in the fight against HIV/AIDS. They have a lot of commonalities there. So I think it's a new way we have to reimagine our fight against HIV. Is getting tougher. Dr. Bex just talked about the low-hanging fruits of HIV in the previous session. As you fight any pandemic and you move towards the end, it gets harder. It gets more challenging to bring it to where it has to be.
Right.
You mentioned your 25-year journey, John, in this battle against HIV, and this latest step for you to become U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator, to lead PEPFAR, the U.S. government's flagship, really global health, not just HIV initiative. It's clearly a significant role to take on, and one that I think a lot of advocates were hoping to see someone named to a bit sooner. You just moved back to the United States 5 weeks ago, I think you said, which is more than a year after the Biden administration started. Can you tell us, maybe pull back the curtain to whatever extent you can, about your conversations with the White House, what sort of mandate they gave you, and what you learned about the Biden administration's vision for PEPFAR specifically, but maybe sort of the architecture that PEPFAR is part of more generally?
So when in summer of last year, I was still in my old role, thinking about the COVID response on the continent. I had briefed the head of states on the continent of Africa almost 15 times, because almost every month you were pulled and put at the center and to describe what is going on with the pandemic, what the response is. So I wasn't thinking of PEPFAR, rightly so, because you were consumed with. Then an email came from the White House saying, we need to consider you for this new role as a PEPFAR coordinator. Initially, I thought it was a scam. I mean, maybe, and I showed that to my
It's
wife.
a very specific scam.
Yeah, I mean, so it took me a week to reply to that because, as you can imagine, I saw with my 25 years experience in HIV/AIDS, I knew that the war against HIV/AIDS was still on. It was a pandemic that was still going on and impacting a lot of, and exposing a lot of the inequalities that we described and inequities that we described there. Then I had to make a judgment call. And at that point, I said, how do you leave a continent that was in the middle of a pandemic to jump ship? But I did an analysis, and I said I had secured 400 million doses of vaccines, the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, through partnerships with the private sector, Strive Masiyiwa, Benedict Orama from the Afri-Exim Bank, under the instructions of the AU chairperson, President Ramaphosa. So we had that covered. With a partnership with the MasterCard Foundation, I had raised 1.5 billion to help with the vaccination. And so it occurred to me that even if I left, the continent was in a good place to roll out vaccination. But you know what I did? I turned to the President Ramaphosa. I said, President, you are the chair of the AU. This is what my president has asked me to do because I was on loan to the African Union. I mean, even my 5 years and a half there, I was secondary staff from the US CDC too. So I said, this is what the White House has said. But if you think I shouldn't go, it is up to you to call the White House and tell them that I cannot leave. So I left it at that. So that was that conversation and it was difficult.
That's a good card to have in your pocket, yes. Yeah. You mentioned that you were engaged in helping to really build these health systems on the African continent to respond to COVID-19. We heard in the last session with Dr. Birx about how PEPFAR really pivoted to also be sort of an all-hands-on-deck initiative or effort to leverage its capabilities to respond to the pandemic as well. At this point, do you see PEPFAR as an HIV initiative or as the foundation of something much broader than that?
I think we still have to remember always that why PEPFAR was authorized. I think I've always described PEPFAR and the Global Fund as the best expression of humanity at best when we apply ourselves to the right problems and solve it collectively for the common interest. So that purpose should always remain visible because the fight, as I said, against HIV/AIDS is far from over. Having said that, we also have to celebrate the progress that has been achieved in the fight against HIV/AIDS over the last close to 20 years, where the rates of infections have come down significantly. It is not where it has to be, but remarkably significant. But the platforms that have been established because of PEPFAR, and in the last session you heard Dr. Birx talked about laboratories systems that she and I conceived, and I worked for her for 10 years, and I was her lab person, go-to person, and I'll pull her from Atlanta and say, look, we have to run around the continent. We have to go to Southeast Asia because we moved a long time ago. We said we shouldn't be referring to these laboratories as HIV reference labs, but public health labs. That was a significant shift that we did so many years ago because we thought that an integrated platforms will be critical to fight any emerging disease. And those platforms are there today in a significant way. So when I hear people say we have to develop systems and tools for pandemic preparedness, I say they are there. They are there abundantly. What we need to do is how do we leverage them and elevate those platforms to be able to fight other emerging disease threats.
Right. I want to slip in a question there about regional institutions. Our colleague Sarah Jerving recently reported on, the WHO's sort of push to limit Africa CDC's power. And given that regional institutions are so important, what do you think about this dynamic that is still playing out in the global health world?
So when I walked in here, I saw on the screen the bold or big ideas, right? I think COVID has taught us that we have to reimagine global health architecture, that we have to look at it at three levels. From my standpoint, we have to look at the global institutions, what role they can play, unique role they can play, and an underlying unique role, and what regional institutions can do, and what local institutions can do. Those are three layers of a global health security architecture that will work for everybody. We have to be very deliberate in that we disrupt the systems that are currently in play positively, because the world has changed a lot since the current systems were put in place. I mean, when structures like WHO were put in place in 1947, the world was 2 billion people. Today, we are close to 8 billion people. The regions are aspiring to take ownership and leadership of their own health security and make it closer to where they are. We should listen. I think it is that act of listening and respectful partnership and listening that will transform the way that global health is reimagined going forward for everybody's collective security. So the discussion with Africa's CDC and WHO, for me, is irrelevant. The question should be, do we need both institutions? The answer is a big yes. You have that in Europe, where European Union created the European CDC and is working very closely with the European WHO, right? And we also have to listen to the aspirations of each region. The ASEAN states are creating their own public health agencies. The Gulf states are creating a Gulf CDC, and I've been consulting, advising, and providing input on how those structures should be set up. So that will only help the world be a better place. There's nothing wrong in identifying a regional institution to identify an emerging infection, squash it before it becomes a threat globally there. That is what we want, isn't it?
Right.
You mentioned working in respectful partnership with other countries and with regional institutions. I actually have the phrase respectful partnership in quotes on this card because it's a phrase that you've used before, including in your testimony, in your confirmation hearing. You highlighted that would be sort of a guiding approach that you think PEPFAR should take under your leadership. It would seem to me that based on your previous position, you would have a unique sort of insight into what health ministers in Africa or heads of state in Africa, what they think of PEPFAR today, what they think of US global health programs today. Given that you've highlighted it a couple of times, is there a sense that respectful partnership has been wanting, or is something that the initiative needs to improve?
I think from where I just left, that is the Africa CDC, which is a specialized agency of the African Union. When my nomination was made, ambassadors after ambassadors after ambassadors came to me to say, we support your move because we know what PEPFAR is. We know what, and we have seen what it has done in our countries. I was in Geneva just last week, as I was telling you, and I met with Dr. Tedros, and we chatted, and I asked for his help to support the US as we push forward for the replenishment. And I also asked for his wisdom on how do we reimagine PEPFAR. You know, the first word that he said was, when he was Minister of Health of Ethiopia and PEPFAR started, he offered hope to the patients. It offered hope to the family. It offers hope to the countries. Remember, we should celebrate the journey we've walked and see HIV/AIDS 25 years ago or 20 years ago. It was a desperate situation. It was scary, and that situation has been transformed. PEPFAR has transformed all of that. So it has the respect of the countries that we are supporting. We should always remember that. It's, as I said earlier, the greatest gift of humanity that, or imagination of humanity that I can think of. So when I use the word respectful partnership, I've been on both sides. I've been on the side of the US government crafting and supporting ideas to support countries. I've been on the receiving end, where people can talk to you, and they talk to you with the ideas that they have, not necessarily the ideas that you want. So that is disrespect. And I think what I'm preaching is co-creation. So you go to a country and you say, where are your priorities? And then you start discussing how to work together to meet those priorities so that you co-create a journey together. I think that's the respectful partnership. And if we do that, then we are speaking directly to the concept of sustainability. You don't come in with an idea and you try to implement the idea, and then 5 years down the road, you say, well, I'm done, you take over and you run over. Of course, look, if you go to any country in Africa or any development, you say, well, I have $5 million to do, to fight TB, and I want to work in this and that clinic, they'll accept. And after 5 years, the funding is over. Of course, it was your idea to do that, not their idea. So that is what I mean by respectful, action-oriented partnerships.
John, what you just described to me sounds like a buzzword that all of us here have heard, very often, at least, in the last couple of years. It's localization, isn't it? And the way to achieve that is through sort of this process of decolonizing health, decolonizing global aid. But the way I see it, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to achieving localization. And like you said, you've seen it from both sides. Launching Africa CDC was one way to do that, and PEPFAR's priorities also sort of outline localization in a big way. As you're taking on this new role, how are you sort of seeing localization kind of play out in the next few years?
I think localization, in my view, is making sure that there's an appropriate mixture between what others can do for you and what you can do for yourself. And we should be very deliberate as we support countries to fight these infections to say we're building capacity locally and enabling that capacity to do the work. And I'll give you an example. It is, if I say, well, I'm putting out a request for proposal, and I say I want it to be competed between African countries and any institution in the West, of course, you know where you end. But if I say, I'm going to sit down with you, walk you through the process of how this is done, enable you and support you to compete for that, then I'm deliberately building the capacity. And sustainability starts at that level. If we truly want the efforts to be sustained, then we have to invest more in those systems. And it's a win-win for everybody. When COVID hit everywhere, guess what? The HIV programs were stalled because there was nobody from the international partners to work, say, in Africa or in any developing country. There were no flights were running around, and there was embargoes for people to travel. So the local partners were the ones doing the job. Okay, they were the ones doing the job. So we should really take a deliberate approach to say that a way to actually appropriately invest our resources is to make sure that we have enough local partners there.
Right. Thank you so much for that, John. We at Devex will be following what you do, and we'll keep reporting on it. Please subscribe to Devex Checkup, our global health newsletter that comes out every Thursday if you haven't already. Thank you so much, Michael. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.